It was foretold. Today is the day of prophecy. It was written in the stars that soon enough a huge comet of balance tuning will hit the live servers. Many will be affected, millions will die. And this is why I was brought here for today, to deliberate on the news of what this prophecy says. The prophecy that talks about what will happen, what will be the fate of all of these specs in this video game in the year 2025. Which is what we're talking about for today in this prophetic getup. What will happen in perhaps even today. You know, right now it's actually 5 p.m. Maybe the balance tuning will actually be hit in the live servers soon enough, or maybe it will be left for the last day, basically the end of this third reset of the season. But what is for certain is that the balance tuning will come. And that is what we are here to prophesize. What, in short, do we expect will be buffed or will be nerfed in the upcoming changes? Or rather, we should ask ourselves, who deserves to be nerfed and who deserves to be buffed based on the results we have been seeing in these first 3 weeks of the season. There will be, of course, a lot of conflicting interests and conflicting ideas based on which spec is doing well in Mythic Plus and which spec is doing well in the raid. Because, of course, if you said, I can totally see Windwalker being nerfed, someone who is interested in Mythic Plus goes along and says Windwalker doesn't deserve any nerfs. What have they done in Mythic Plus to deserve to be nerfed? And then you could be saying the reverse. I can't wait until finally we get rid of this pesky balanced druid in the S+ tier of Mythic Plus. And then someone comes along and points out that balanced druid is terrible right now in the raid. So that is also something that will have to be considered. Sometimes this will be hard to balance because the spec is playing in a similar way in both activities, and one is good, the other is bad. In other cases, it can be simpler simply because one spec, for example, is doing very well in single target but poorly in AoE. So, you know, buff the AoE, nerf the single target, that kind of situation. So let's start by looking at what we mentioned likely was going to be a bigger focus for balancing in this very first round, which is the raid. Because, of course, of the raid to World First, there was much more emphasis on that, more so than Mythic Plus. There are also not really that many groups bothering too much about playing Mythic Plus right now. They are perhaps more busy raiding, bringing up speed leveling and speed gearing more characters at a good level at the beginning of the season, you know, thinking about perhaps playing 2 or 3 different DPS specs right now, so they don't have that much time to be pushing. So that's where most of the interest likely will go for when it comes to the balance tuning in this very first round. But whatever, let's begin with the first sinner. The first sinner is undoubtedly Fire Mage. Yeah, well, there isn't really much to say about Fire. We just said maybe a spec is doing well in Mythic Plus but not in the raid, maybe vice versa, maybe it's harder to balance. Not the case for Fire. Fire is currently one of the top 3 DPS in the raid, and simultaneously the most played spec in Mythic Plus. So, you know, I'm not an expert in balance tuning, but likely they are the one who deserves to be nerfed the most, purely based on how well they are doing right now, how extremely well, because perhaps what has been the issue with Fire Mage wasn't even just the damage they were doing, but the other things. As you have all been perhaps keeping an eye out on things like the race to World First, and you saw 2 mages being played, and then 3 mages being played, maybe even 4 Fire Mages being played. The problem was not just their damage, it was their mobility, their blinking, their alter timing, their displacements back and forth to be able to cover massive amount of distances much more and quickly compared to other specs. And if that wasn't the issue, you also have their defensive tools. You have their barrier, their mass barrier. You have their alter time, which is still a defensive tool, not just a movement tool. It's a 2-in-1. And then you also have the mirror image. You still have their ice cold, which if they want, why not? Let's bring it back to be an immunity. You still also have their cheat death, because why not? Why not also give them a cheat death? So there is honestly quite the large set of points you can attack Fire Mage for nerfs. It could be AoE damage in particular. It perhaps not as much single target, definitely AoE damage. It could be their spread cleave with ignite damage in general. It could also be their mobility. It could be their defensiveness. Really, your pick. We haven't even mentioned they also have a raid buff, because why not? But it's just way too many things all at once. This has always been a problem, but it just went under the radar because mage is so popular. So there is a massive propaganda of players pushing to suppress all of the complaints about this class as a whole. But definitely the first in line that will receive nerfs, 100%. It is written and foretold that Fire Mage will be nerfed in this first round of tuning. Otherwise, I fear I will have to bring back my clown costume to actually point out how wrong this was. But for sure, Fire Mage will be nerfed. However, is there anyone else who deserves the nerf? Well, of course, you could switch for a second back to Mythic Plus and wonder about the state of tanks and healers. What can we do about the Mythic Plus tanks, and what can we do about the Mythic Plus healers? Honestly, I don't think we can do much about the Mythic Plus tanks. This is for the next chapter of this video, which will be which specs deserves to be buffed. I don't think Vengeance particularly deserves nerfs. They don't even have right now the best damage, even in terms of survivability. It's not that they are far above other tanks, it's just what other tanks are lacking more than Vengeance at the moment. Things get even more problematic when it comes to Mythic Plus. Because in Mythic Plus right now, the 2-go spec is Discipline. However, in the raid, the 2-go spec is Mistweaver. Ever since Lenience was nerfed from no longer double stacking, which has perhaps completely removed the chances of playing double disc, even in race to world first guilds, as Mistweaver being the highlight of the progress so far. So you have Mistweaver doing very well in the raid. It is still doing also very well in Mythic Plus, just overshadowed by Discipline Priest. But it's perhaps not even because of the Discipline Priest does better that deserves to be nerfed, because Discipline Priest does less HPS. If you put them one by one and try to see how much they can heal, Mistweaver would win in a 5-group content scenario. In fact, the Discipline Priest will actually also lose to rest of the raid, not even just to Mistweaver. If you look at the damage, Mistweaver also wins against Discipline. In fact, one of the major advantages is double pain suppression being better than Life Cocoon in terms of defensiveness between the two specs, and that's about it. You have the added sure power infusion that Discipline can give out to your group over the extra damage of Mistweaver. But it would be hard. It would be hard to pinpoint where would Discipline Priest be nerfed at the moment over Mistweaver. Mistweaver will definitely require some nerfs in the terms of overall throughput in the raid. You can also attack particular raid throughput rather than Mythic Plus throughput tools, because their HPS in the raid is a bit too overboard, especially because of how simple it is to play. Especially the melee fist-weaving Chi-Ji version is bafflingly simple to play for this much healing. Same for Discipline. If you wanted to bring down their HPS a little bit more in the raid without hurting too much Mythic Plus, you could perhaps nerf again some of their atonement healing in return for buffing a bit more some of their single target heals to make it at least still more valuable in Mythic Plus compared to the raid. But in general, it again is still a case of buffing the more underperforming healers. Still not expecting too many nerfs, besides perhaps some 3 to 5 maybe percent throughput HPS nerfs for Mistweaver and for Discipline equally. Now back to the DPS, talking about the nerfs. Again, looking at the cross-referencing who is doing well in the raid and who is doing well in Mythic Plus to see if there are some of the DPS specs double dipping right now as much as Fire Mage is. The answer, of course, is no. Talking about the top performers in Mythic Plus, for example, you have Balance Druid. But we just mentioned Balance Druid has been doing quite poorly in the raid. In the overall results, Balance Druid has been quite dreadful. You might have seen at the beginning some better results of Balance just because you had earlier fewer logs because of sticks multi-targeting adds spread around allowed you to pad some of the meter with damage for balance, right? But as we go deeper down the raid, balance druid will not be doing nearly as well. So Mythic plus good, raid bad. This is a case of you might see two things at once, i.e. you might see the damage, the AoE damage of balance druid being nerfed. So you can go and touch things like a balanced druid's starfall damage, which is of course insane in AoE. In AoE, in Mythic plus, that kind of AoE damage. You might also touch other things specifically for AoE, like Fury of Elune, the splash damage of Starfire, the damage of Wild Mushrooms, basically a whole bunch of stuff, mostly just for AoE, while of course buffing their single target, right? If you go and focus a balanced druid's Starsword damage, shooting stars perhaps, Moonfire damage to do more damage on single target, to try to fix this disparity that right now balanced druid has between their AoE and their single target. But it wouldn't be just a nerf or just a buff to the spec. So it's not a one thing like Fire Mage for balanced druid, even while being very popular like Fire Mage in Mythic plus. Other specs, again, Unholy. Unholy is also doing very well in Mythic plus. We just had a video about the growth of Unholy in Mythic plus. In the raid, Unholy is middling. So perhaps there might be another angle of buffing Unholy's single target damage at the cost of nerfing Unholy's AoE damage. Now, we have also had specific videos about how Unholy works right now in Mythic plus. How do they do their AoE damage as a Sun Lane, no pet kind of damage. Death Coil, Vampiric Strike, their Blood Beast exploding for AoE damage, those would be the things to target. It's a bit complicated, of course, because Death Coil also is used in single target. Vampiric Strike also is your main source of damage in single target. So it would be hard to try to nerf them to simultaneously try to nerf their AoE. If you wanted to buff the single target but nerfing the AoE, it could be somewhat tricky. When it comes to Unholy, you would have, of course, to go and target the Blood Beast. You would have to go and target the explosion of the Blood Beast. Yeah, but perhaps make it proc more often, make it less RNG on when it procs, but lower the damage. In exchange, perhaps, of buffing their single target, maybe even more in different ways than just straight up buffing their Death Coil, which is already a problem before, and they had to nerf Death Coil because of how much they buffed it in the first place. Maybe buff other things that are not up to par right now to make them the new way to play single target, like, for example, pets. Go back. Allow Unholy to go back to Rider, to go back to play with pets, and to go back to be that the way to play single target, and keep this Sun Lane build for AoE, albeit perhaps a bit nerfed. Now, other specs currently at the top in Mythic plus, after these first three we mentioned, would be Elemental Shaman, would in terms of sheer, just in terms of sheer damage right now, and popularity. After these three specs, you have Elemental Shaman, and actually even Feral Druid. Despite its unpopularness, it's still doing very high damage in Mythic plus. So comparing to how they are doing in the raid right now, Elemental is woeful. Elemental Shaman is much more straightforward because they have weak single target and great AoE, which fits greatly with doing poorly in the raid and very well in Mythic plus. Feral Druid is a bit more precise because they do still also have good single target. Even if you go and look at the damage to bosses in the raid, Feral Druid is amongst the top. And then you go and look at the overall AoE, all key damage in Mythic plus, you have Feral Druid doing one of the top damage in AoE as well. So it doesn't seem like it's in need of any nerf simply because of how little it is being considered right now. Perhaps if you brought any more than just damage and top kills were triple stacking Feral Druid in a fight the same way they were triple stacking a Windwalker Monk or a Fire Mage, maybe players would have thought about nerfs for Feral Druid, but not really right now. The one that same treatment for Elemental Shaman, their top AoE damage in Mythic plus is offset by their weak damage in the raid. And it's not that you can give everyone the same treatment, it's not that you can constantly nerf the top AoE specs and then buff them in their weak single target. Sometimes it's good. Sometimes it's good to just have specs specialized in being good at one thing and bad at the other. It's more unfair when there is a spec that is good at everything, like we just mentioned, the cursed existence of Fire Mage. But no, despite having good damage right now in Mythic Plus, neither Elemental or Feral are in the chopping block for any nerfs. We are kind of run out of specs doing well in Mythic Plus, wondering if they deserve nerfs. Time to go and look at some of the specs doing well in the raid to see if they deserve nerfs. Some of those will be overlapping, like we mentioned, Fire Mage of course doing well. Windwalker is the talk of the moment. After the stacking of Windwalker in the top guild runs of the Race to World First, there is a question about the insane damage of Windwalker Monk, which was, by the way, even higher on average than a Fire Mage. So the thing with Windwalker Monk is their damage doesn't even have a weak damage profile. They barely, their damage is so universal, kind of. They barely even change talents to go from AoE to single target, to go from Mythic Plus to the raid. Same hero talent, same keystone major points, like still running, of course, with Whirling Dragon Punch, obviously. Ignoring the right side of the tree, even when it is more specialized for AoE around your feline stomp talents. No, ignored. You still run the same setup in Mythic Plus for AoE or in the raid for single target, and you're still doing greatly. Now, obviously, there is a partial excuse in the fact that right now, despite doing great in the raid, it hasn't really found nearly as much room in Mythic Plus. Now, the fact that you are not that played in Mythic Plus, is it a good excuse not to be nerfed, even if you do have top damage, even if you are not that popular? The answer is probably no. The answer is regardless of how popular you are, if your damage is overboard, it is still overboard. So likely Windwalker will still have to be nerfed, mostly in single target, partially in AoE in this next round of tuning, amongst the same lines as Fire Mage, without having nearly the same other advantages of mobility, utility, and just defensiveness that a Fire Mage can get. But it is still on the chopping block for nerfs when it comes to DPS. Other DPS specs doing well in the raid right now are much harder to punish because of how poorly they are doing in Mythic Plus, or simply how okay they are doing in Mythic Plus. We are talking about Assassination, Outlaw, Havoc, Shadow Priest, Enhancement, Affliction. These specs, would you even want to nerf them right now? Don't forget also, as we pointed out before, that these overall rankings and overall results are just for the first few bosses. If you look at, for example, specs going for Sprocketmonger, right? You have about 6 or 7 logs available on Sprocket, right? And after that, it's gonna be 0. So obviously you don't have the full picture anyways on the performance of the specs on the entire tier. So trying to make a decision on the early results for these bosses, besides the current buggedness of Outlaw, there isn't much else. Besides Fire, which we mentioned, and besides Windwalker, which we mentioned, most of the other things are in line. Even things like Affliction. Affliction shows up as the 4th best spec. No. Affliction is here because they are double dotting in the middle of the room the 2 bosses in Cauldron of Carnage, because they are also doing AoE damage on the ads on Rick Reverb. It will likely stay up because right after these bosses you have One Arm Bandit, which is more multi-dotting craziness for Affliction. Same goes for Shadow Priest as well. So overall, despite currently showing up as doing pretty well, they don't feel like they deserve any nerfs at the moment. So at the end round, when it comes to who deserves to be nerfed, in the end, as pure nerfs, we only have Fire and Windwalker. In other cases, you might have some splits, like Balance Druid doing greatly in AoE but poorly in single target. Perhaps you could nerf their AoE to buff their single target. Elemental is the same, very poor single target after the nerfs before this season, but very strong AoE. Maybe you could adjust that. But those will still count as both nerfs and buffs. In terms of purely nerfing specs, right now on the chopping block, we are expecting Windwalker and Fire. That's the 2 ones we would have to see nerfed. For tanks, not really any nerfs. And for healers, Discipline and Mistweaver mostly in throughput and not really much of anything else in terms of their talent, their toolkit in talents. Moving on to the opposite, which is, okay, but who do we want to see buffed? Obviously, it's simple to make this argument. Just look at the top 10 worst specs and buff them all. Simple, easy, solved. You know, a lot of times this is more complicated than that, because some of these specs might not even be that more poor, that much worse compared to others. They are simply very underplayed or don't fit a Mythic Plus comp, for example. So buffing them by 10% would just be an overkill, unnecessary. It's just, the reason why it's not good is not because of that. Now, starting from the notion that we obviously don't want to see Augmentation Evoker buffed. We don't care about Augmentation Evoker doing poorly. There are other specs that even by sims are not supposed to be doing this badly or this poorly, like Survival, for example, or like Feral Druid in the raid, or things like Frost Decay and Unholy, which are supposed to be already simming quite well anyways in the raid. So we don't really expect them to be buffed. You have some specs, or in some cases, some talents of some specs doing very poorly after being changed or after being nerfed, not really doing nearly as well. Affliction, single target, is still a huge problem. Destruction as well, in pure single target, it is still a big problem. Marksmanship, the mega rework of Hunter has hit marksmanship quite poorly in terms of damage, much more poorly than Beastmastery Hunter. So that is where you could see buffs as well to the spec. You know, marksmanship, destruction, affliction, frost, but especially arcane in single target damage also could receive some buffs. To be fair, arcane would receive buffs anywhere, but I don't want to have mages being buffed in general, so we can skip them as well. Obviously, the simple answer based on what Blizzard is seeing from the results in these first 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks, is to just aura buff a whole bunch of DPS specs, as we mentioned. Aura buff meaning we want to buff you in your AoE, in your single target, because that's how poor we think you are. For example, Arcane could get an aura buff for their damage. Frost Mage could not, because Frost Mage is already doing very, very good AoE damage. It's already one of the top builds being run in the very highest of keys next to Fire Mage. Depending on the dungeon as well, you can run Frost Mage as well in Mythic Plus just fine. So they don't require a 5% buff to AoE, but for the single target, yes, they could. Marksmanship could be getting their 5% aura buff. Elemental doesn't need a 5% aura buff, just a single target damage buff. That's for the raid. For Mythic Plus, you know, same thing. Maybe specs that are doing fine in single target, but more poorly in AoE, like Assassination and Outlaw. But, you know, Assassination and Outlaw are also doing quite well in the raid anyways. It's not that they are that weak in there as well. Same with Sab, honestly. Rogue, as a whole, is in a pretty awkward spot. They are doing well, just not meta in Mythic Plus, in the large picture, and also not one of the strongest in the raid, but still very good. So I wouldn't actually want to touch them. Besides fixing the coup de grace bug of Outlaw, which is giving them much more damage than they should have, but besides that, I would leave them alone. That's more or less it for all of these DPS specs, the buffs you might be expecting. Arcane, Frost Mage, Marksmanship Hunter, Affliction, and Destruction. Some others like Furies, AoE damage compared to arms could be offset a little bit. Some other that we mentioned being half and half, like Windwalker, possibly even Enhancement Shaman having more AoE damage at the cost of their single target damage in the raid, possibly. Those are what we could be expecting coming in this incoming balance tuning round from Blizzard for the DPS. A lot of it has to do about CC, crowd control, and mob control in the dungeon, which Vengeance is quite good at, similar to Prot Paladin. It's just that now, after Prot Paladin being nerfed, as we have seen, Vengeance took over. You would have to ask quite a lot of Guardian Druids, and even more so by Brewmaster Monk, to be able to have the same amount of control of enemies as those tanks have. As we said, it's not even a problem about damage, which Vengeance isn't insane at. It's not that why. It's a very strong spec, so you don't even expect the other tanks to be buffed in damage. So it's more about their defensiveness, their survivability at every pull, every cycle of pack being pulled by the Vengeance Demon Hunter, having constant tankiness and constant defensiveness in Aldrachi River, more so than the meta cyclical Demon Surge of a Felskard now that Eldritch Reaver has been buffed by quite a lot before this patch. It's a very good setup for Vengeance, so really just not unlikely something that can be fixed by a hotfix weekly tuning for tanks. You can't just say, you can't just buff Guardian Druid by 10% more damage and give them 10% more Iron for armor and some more healing to suddenly make them as viable and as good as Vengeance. Now for healers, Discipline, as we mentioned, doesn't really have top damage. You wouldn't need to buff the other healers in terms of damage. You still should, because they are doing too little damage anyways, especially Resto Shaman and even Resto Druid in this new version should be buffed a bit more after the nerfs to their damage. But as always, it's a bit confusing to try to find what is this priest good at. As we mentioned, from this explanation, they don't have the best damage, they don't have the best healing, they don't even have the best utility out of all of the healers. So what do they do? What do they even do best? They have what, 2 externals to give out and API. Is that enough to make them the absolute meta pick? Well, not really. The answer is not really. As mentioned, if Holy Paladin were to be buffed to have decent damage and much better throughput compared to what they have now, they could be an option. They could have the tools, the defensive tool, the spot healing tools. They just miss the HPS in their case. In the case of Resto Shaman, it's unlikely for them to be missing out on their HPS power. Right now they are pretty fine in group content. They are a bit weaker if they play Totemic in the spot healing and they still don't have an external. They are practically bound to have to use Spirit Link as an external for their tank, so it's kind of a problem there. That's what would have to be buffed for Resto Shaman. So it's a bit harder to find the angle to buff the healers in Mythic Plus to pass Discipline and even Mistweaver, not even just Discipline. For the raid, it's more about throughput for Resto Shaman, Holy Priest and Evoker, Preservation Evoker. They don't really have anything broken right now. They could easily become quite good by simply buffing their throughput more. In the case of Resto Shaman, helping them with their mana especially. What could be perhaps a bigger problem would be fixing Holy Paladin in a weekly reset set of buffs. They have larger problems than just needing a 10% healing buff. So it would just be, in that case, a band-aid before a possible rework or just significant fixing of their rotation and their talents. So it's unlikely to see them change by much in this tuning. But since we're asking who deserves to be buffed and who deserves to be nerfed, then yes. In terms of tanks, I would say Guardian and Brewmaster deserve to be buffed. I don't think Blood, actually, despite not being meta. It's not that if you are not meta, you need to be buffed. I don't think Blood and Prot Warrior, as well as Prot Paladin, need to be buffed, particularly. Of the tanks, I would say Guardian and Brewmaster should require more buffs than the other tanks. For healers, I think Holy Paladin and Holy Priest, in terms of sheer throughput, are the ones in more need of buffs compared to the other healers when it comes to the raid. That's for healers. We have gone to tanks as well, and then the DPS as well, on who do we expect, who do we think is going to receive buffs or going to receive nerfs in this upcoming, somewhere upcoming balance tuning, whether it is literally today or before the next reset. That is when we expect the balance tuning to come, the first of this reset. But for today, on this Prophesizing Friday, we are done with each other. So we are starting the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched this here video. Thank you, of course, to liking and commenting on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, all buffs are good. All buffs will be good, just not one, just not Augmentation Evoker. At least until 12.3, I don't want to see augmentations in my groups anymore.